El INACIPE te invita a participar en su ciclo de talleres completamente gratuitos. Muy pronto podrás aprender los temas más relevantes en ciencias penales donde quiera que te encuentres. Con los martes de taller podrás incrementar tus conocimientos y obtener tu constancia de participación. Queda pendiente de nuestras redes sociales. Ahí te daremos a conocer el procedimiento oportunamente. No te quedes fuera. Porque en el INACIPE se viven las ciencias penales.
Soy José Fernández de Ceballos y en esta ocasión hablaremos de la actuación policial en el procesamiento de evidencia. Para tratar este tema nos acompaña Bernardino Rico Maya.
Se deja a un criminalista hacer un procesamiento cuando es una actuación policial y puede quedar en un riesgo inminente si es un cateo o si es otro evento. Los criminalistas son los que están haciendo estos procesamientos cuando es una obligación de la policía con capacidades para procesar y obviamente de las personas o de las entidades federativas.
Muy buenas tardes. Sean todas y todos ustedes bienvenidos a esta conferencia interactiva del Instituto Nacional de Ciencias Penales. Esta tarde tengo el gusto de presentar a ustedes una mesa de análisis conformada por peritos expertos de México y Canadá, quienes traen esta tarde el tema Sexual Assault Investigations, from Evidence Collection to Analysis. A nuestras y nuestros espectadores les recordamos que este es un espacio de participación y de importante reflexión, por lo que les invitamos a que escriban sus preguntas utilizando el hashtag INACIPE responde para unirse a la conversación. También les recordamos que las opiniones vertidas en este evento son de exclusiva responsabilidad de quienes las emiten y no representan necesariamente el pensamiento de INACIPE. Comenzaremos por escuchar a la maestra Carmen Isabel Santos Cabrera. Ella es maestra en Biología Experimental, perito en Genética Forense en la Fiscalía General de la Ciudad de México y perito en Genético Forense de la Fiscalía General del Estado de Baja California Sur, con más de 10 años de experiencia en el área forense. Actualmente funge como titular del área de Genética, Química y Serología de AG Servicios Periciales. Maestra, bienvenida esta tarde, por favor.
¿Qué tal? Muy buenas tardes a todos y les doy también la más cordial bienvenida a este conversatorio. Como ya lo comentó la maestra Cintia, pues el tema del día de hoy es acerca de las agresiones sexuales y cómo nosotros las vamos a abordar. Entonces, les voy a dar una pequeña introducción y después vamos a darle la palabra a el otro experto forense. Muy bien. Me gustaría comenzar, primero que nada, con dar unas pequeñas definiciones. ¿Ok? Muy bien. Comenzar con lo que es la violencia sexual. Muy bien, la Organización Mundial de la Salud define a la violencia sexual como todo acto sexual, tentativa de consumar un acto sexual. Incluye los comentarios o insinuaciones sexuales que no son deseadas, así como acciones que se emplean para comercializar o utilizar de cualquier modo la sexualidad de una persona mediante una coacción. Esta coacción va a estar ejercida por otra persona, un tercero. Y esta interacción es independiente de la relación que estos dos individuos guarden, es decir, de la relación que guarda el agresor con la víctima y se puede desarrollar en cualquier ámbito. Incluimos el hogar y el lugar de trabajo. Ahora bien, vamos a hablar un poco acerca de estas coacciones. ¿A qué se refiere? Bueno, pues puede abarcar un uso en diferentes grados de la fuerza, que se pueda hacer una intimidación psicológica sobre la víctima, una extorsión o a través de amenazas se atente contra esta integridad y esta libertad sexual de otra persona. ¿Qué contextos vamos a tener en esta violencia sexual? Se puede dar dentro del matrimonio o del noviazgo. Puede ser ejecutada por desconocidos, la víctima no los conoce. Puede tener un fin lucrativo y que se vea por una prostitución forzada, a cambio de favores que se pida el acto sexual. En conflictos bélicos es común que en el lugar donde se está llevando a cabo este conflicto, pues se detengan este tipo de violencia. O el tráfico de personas con la finalidad de una explotación sexual. Muy bien, ahora que ya hablamos en qué contexto se puede dar este tipo de violencia, vamos a hablar de qué personas son vulnerables a sufrir este tipo de agresiones. En primer lugar tenemos a las mujeres, a los niños y las niñas, personas que pertenecen a la comunidad LGBT+, así como las personas que presentan algún tipo de discapacidad, ya sea física o mental. Estos van a representar a nuestros grupos vulnerables de sufrir este tipo de violencia. Ahora bien, si bien se toma en cuenta por parte de esta definición de violencia sexual que esta agresión puede ser hacia hombres o mujeres, se ha visto que se presenta con mayor frecuencia que se ejerzca esta violencia sexual por hombres hacia cualquiera de estos grupos vulnerables y con una mayor presencia, una mayor frecuencia de estas agresiones son las que se dan, las que se ejercen los hombres sobre las mujeres. Muy bien, vamos a hablar ahora un poco acerca de lo que es la agresión sexual. Electra González y colaboradores definen la agresión sexual como un evento traumático y doloroso que va a afectar de manera transversal a las víctimas, independientemente de su sexo, y que se puede presentar en cualquier nivel socioeconómico, aunque sí se ha observado una tendencia que las personas que pertenecen a un nivel socioeconómico bajo van a ser más vulnerables a sufrir de este tipo de eventos. Vamos ahora a hablar de cómo vamos a determinar esta violencia sexual, cómo se va a ver manifestada a través de estas agresiones. Vamos a tener como primer lugar el hostigamiento sexual, ¿ok? Estos comentarios, estas insinuaciones. También podemos englobar en este caso a los eventos de violaciones, ¿ok? Que pues se fuerza a la persona a tener el acto sexual. O finalmente, pero no menos importante, que sea el abuso sexual. Aquí pueden englobarse ya sea los tocamientos o, por ejemplo, masturbaciones que se puedan dar en frente de alguna persona, se considera como un abuso sexual. Cabe destacar que estas conductas en la mayoría de los países están tipificadas como delitos, entonces se investigan. Y es de lo que vamos a hablar a continuación. ¿Cómo vamos a hacer esta investigación cuando tenemos una agresión sexual? Tanto en la modalidad de abuso sexual como de las violaciones, tenemos una ventaja importante para poder nosotros investigar estos eventos. Y es que vamos a poder localizar e identificar rastros de elementos biológicos. Principalmente dentro de estos elementos biológicos tenemos a los fluidos biológicos y el de mayor relevancia va a ser la identificación y localización de semen para que a través de su análisis podamos nosotros establecer la identidad genética del agresor a través de conocer su perfil genético. Ok, entonces, para nosotros poder ir de la identificación de este rastro, de este fluido biológico que vamos a localizar en nuestra víctima, hasta poder determinar la identidad genética de nuestro agresor, hay un paso muy importante que nos va a permitir hacer esta relación y es la colecta y el análisis de las muestras. Esto es de vital importancia. Si esta colecta y análisis no se realiza de manera adecuada, comprometemos el objetivo principal, que es poder dar esta identidad genética a nuestro agresor. ¿Ok? Y para hablarnos más de este tema, voy a dar el uso de la palabra a mi colega Randy Steele. Voy a dejar de compartir.
Good afternoon. I'm just going to share my screen here in just a second. All right. So first off, thank you very much for the invitation today to speak to the Mexican forensic community. It's a privilege to be able to share some of the strategies that we are using for sexual assault investigations at my laboratory in Ontario, Canada. So, as I said, I am based in Ontario, Canada, in the city of Toronto, at the Centre of Forensic Sciences, and it's a forensic laboratory that's run by the government. So it's a government laboratory. This is where we're located. If you know if you know Ontario, we've got two laboratories. One is located in the northern part of the province in Sault Ste. Marie. It's on the left-hand side of the screen. And my laboratory, where I work at, is the larger of the two laboratories, and that's in Toronto. It was recently built, and we moved in 2013. So it's a state-of-the-art facility. And this is just kind of a snapshot of the tests and services that we can conduct for sexual assault investigations. So within the biology section, of course, we have a number of options for us. Our chemistry section can perform a bunch of tests as well: lubricants, hair and fiber analysis, and damage, if it's relevant to the investigation. And of course, the toxicology section can do their standard tests for drugs and poisons, and alcohol within the blood and urine collected in the kits. But I'm going to speak to you today about the biology component, because I am a forensic biologist. Just before I get further in, so I have been working at the center for 20 years now, working on casework in that time. I started in 2001 and as a scientist since 2008. So that's kind of my background, specializing in forensic biology and forensic DNA testing. So what I want to talk to you about today is to outline some of the strategies we've taken to assist in more quickly or expediting the possibility of generating results in sexual assault examinations. There was a time when laboratories were struggling to examine the backlog of sexual assault kits in their specific jurisdictions, or the cities or communities that they were servicing. So we took a very proactive approach, and we wanted to kind of come up with a way that gets results very quickly, or more quickly, to our clients, which would be the police agencies, and have those results more quickly help investigations to assist in identifying suspects and in cases that maybe otherwise we wouldn't have been able to get to if we had not made these changes. So one thing that we do is we've gone right back to, we made changes with even the design of our sexual assault kit. So we base our collection times in terms of the maximum timelines that we will instruct our nurses to collect samples, specific samples within the sexual assault examination kit. And these are based on the current sensitivity of forensic DNA technology and the available literature on the persistence of semen and DNA, specifically in the body cavities that we sample from, specifically anal swabs, vaginal swabs, oral swabs, and the swabs of the external genitalia. And we worked with our partners designing these kits to make sure that not only were these changes beneficial for us, but it was also beneficial to the police agencies and the nurses working with them. So what we've done is the majority of the samples and the most common samples accepted and collected are mainly swabs and clothing that are relevant to the investigation. And how those are packaged means that these can be stored at room temperature. So the storage conditions are much easier to meet within these agencies. Blood and urine are typically are standardly accepted, and if those are accepted, then those are two types of samples that would require refrigeration. And in the rare instance where we have tampons or sanitary napkins that were collected at the time of the collection of the kit, or diapers or condoms, in the rare cases that these types of samples are collected, then these would be required to be frozen. But as I said, the majority of the samples tend to be room temperature, and those are the ones that are most commonly collected. So all this comes down to, how long do you think male DNA from semen can last in the vagina after internal ejaculation? This is a question that we asked ourselves, because this, of course, informs our strategies with sampling, what items to examine, how long after the incident would we still examine that item, etc. So at our laboratory, we conducted a literature study, and the citation is found below. And I'm not going to go into it today, but please feel free to look up that citation, because that formed a lot of the opinions that we utilized for how we process casework. But what came out of that was the understanding and the knowledge that after ejaculation, we are able to detect sperm or male DNA in the following cavities at these maximum times: on the oral swab up to 1 day post-incident, the anal swab up to 3 days, and a vaginal swab up to 12 days. However, the majority of DNA in the vaginal cavity is lost within 2 to 3 days due to drainage and degradation. This can also be increased. The rate at which it's lost can be increased if the individual is on their menstrual cycle, or where the individual is on their menstrual cycle, and other cleaning and showering and things like that can impact it. Whether they employ a daily douche or anything like that could also facilitate removal. So keep those timelines in your mind, because we utilize those then when we instruct our nurses for the kit collection. So we collect up to 12 days post-assault. Clothing and any related items. Clothing can be accepted even past 12 days, because, as you know, once DNA material or body fluids are deposited onto clothing, if undisturbed and unlaundered, samples from these items can be detected there years and years post-incident. So these timelines only really relate to the specific samples from the body of the complainant when collecting the kit. So I'm going to focus now on the internal swabs and the external genitalia swabs. So, as I think is standard for most kits, these swabs are collected in duplicate. They're collected at the same time. So those two swabs, say when collecting a sample from the vaginal cavity of the complainant, these two swabs are collected at the same time, which means that both of these swabs are considered to be identical. So what we do is we utilize the first swab for our testing, and the second swab remains untested, unaltered, and that is kept for any possible future testing that could be required, additional body fluid testing or lubricant testing, and also, very importantly, to be able to meet the requests for independent testing by defense counsel down the road. Now, you may be thinking, okay, it says here DNA testing on the first swab and then body fluid analysis. I don't get it. This seems backwards to me. Shouldn't you be doing body fluid testing up front? And I'll touch on that a little bit in just a little bit. This is just a very quick summary of what I just said. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's just to kind of highlight in a quick snapshot, the timelines that we utilize all depends on the case scenario and the case details provided to us from both the police agency and the nurse who collects the kit. So oral swab collected within 24 hours, vaginal swab, if there's penile penetration, we instruct them to collect it even up to 12 days. If it's only digital penetration, collect within 7 days. And on the anal swab, collect it within 3 days. If it's within 3 days. Anything outside of that, we tell them there's no need to collect it. Similarly, the external genitalia swabs, because these aren't internal swabs, it is an external swab. Again, we have found that these swabs can be actually more successful in generating DNA results from a male individual or male perpetrator than sometimes the internal vaginal swabs. And this is because the vaginal swabs have a large amount of female or a larger amount of female DNA contained on them just by the fact of how they're collected. Whereas the external genitalia swab, you're still going to have some female DNA there, as the complainant is swabbed looking for male perpetrator DNA or suspect DNA, but less of it. So if you have less female, you're better able to detect the male DNA that may or may not be there. So again, these days, these timelines again are very structured, and we wanted to make it very easy for the nurses who collect the kits to kind of work through it, stepwise fashion, and have very clear lines for when they would or would not collect. Now, of course, we know we would rather, if they are ever uncertain, if they're ever unsure, then collect it. You only have one chance to collect the evidence, so if you over collect, that's fine. You'd rather over collect samples rather than under collect. And again, if it's a male complainant, then again we can also collect swabs. In this instance, the external genitalia would be the penis or the scrotum area, again, or the anal area, with again all of the other samples as well that I'm going to talk to right now. Other samples that are potentially relevant: fingernails, if they were scratching, we'll collect those up to 3 days or 72 hours. Skin swabs, if there's biting or external ejaculation or licking or kissing of any particular areas on the body. And breast swabs, if there's touching or within 72 hours. And as a note, we find really good success with detecting male DNA on breast swabs from suspects in sexual assault investigations. A lot of times ejaculation doesn't occur because their assault is interrupted, or there's a condom used, or a number of reasons. The individual's vasectomized, a number of reasons why we may not detect DNA on the internal swabs, but we find that breast swabs are very successful. So if you don't already do those, I would suggest considering starting to look at those, because again, we have very good success with those. So that's a big primer then on the type of samples and the timelines. So how does all that feed in now when it comes to the laboratory? Well, we've taken a very restricted approach in terms of making sure that we only get a certain amount, a certain subset of available items to examine at any given time. This is called hypothesis-based testing. So it really comes down to DNA is a very powerful tool, but only when appropriately used and its significance is properly conveyed. So we are a government lab, and the police agencies are allowed to use us. And they are not charged. They don't pay for the use of our testing. But we still, as scientists, have carriage or have authority in terms of what items we're going to accept and what items we're not going to accept, or we will not accept at this time. So we employ this. Basically, our purpose is: can an individual be excluded as a source of a DNA profile that is developed from a body fluid, stain, or other bodily substance? And we continue this testing until this question is answered. So what does this mean? Well, we get the case history information from the police agency. We have the information that's contained on the sexual assault evidence forms that are collected at the time that the kit is collected. And we will go through all of the information and we will make an assessment as to which items are most relevant and which items are most likely to generate a result. We then use that to determine what exams are to be conducted, what bodily fluids are we expecting to find, what items should we accept, and then we basically ensure that the items that we accept, will the results obtained from these items assist in answering the investigative questions? So we won't just do items because the police agencies ask for them to be done. We need to know, what question is this testing going to address for your investigation? And then if that can be properly conveyed to us, then we will conduct the analysis for them and see what results we are able to generate. So we utilize this. This really allows us to structure the input of items into our case approach and into the laboratory, into the individuals who's responsible to examine these, without inundating our laboratory with so many items from one case that it prevents us from getting to the other cases. So we utilize the forms and case details, and we make decisions on those. We do the strategy, and then the police only submit the items accepted by the scientist. Any other items in the kit that we've determined either aren't relevant based on the case details that have been provided at the time, or they're items that are maybe more apt, or keeping the possibility of additional items for supplemental or secondary submissions, but only after the initial work is completed on the items that are most relevant and the items that look like they would have the greatest chance of generating a DNA result, for the agency. This allows us to perform the testing much more quickly, allows us to report it much more quickly, and gets a DNA result hopefully into the hands of the investigating agency much more quickly. Rather than spending all of this time doing 10 or 15 items, we may be able to only examine 3 or 4 or 1 or 2, depending on what the results are. So how do we do this? We still utilize our detection of body fluids, and blood, semen, and saliva. Those are still our tried and true methods. We will still utilize those when we examine clothing, and utilizing when we need to use those tests to assist us to localize or find which areas to sample for DNA. But what's nice about sexual assault kits is that on the swabs, you don't need to localize, because everything's going to be contained on the end of the swab, of the cotton swab. So there's no real need to find it, because we know it's on the end of we know the sample's on the end of the swab that was taken. So we utilize our body fluid, and then of course we'll utilize our DNA analysis. And this is just a very quick depiction in terms of the 4 basic steps that every forensic laboratory uses: extraction, quantitation, amplification of the areas of interest, and then detection of the profile in a graphical format. And this is an example of a graphical format. If you have not seen a DNA profile before, this is ultimately the result that we get, or that I get as a scientist, in a case file, and I'll have any number of these depending on the number of samples that have been processed. And this is what we then use to interpret interpret the DNA profiles and ultimately write a report. So since 2002, we took a very bold approach to how we flow our sexual assault samples through our laboratory. We use a direct to DNA approach, and we've been doing this since 2012. So we do DNA analysis conducted on the relevant internal swabs, oral, vaginal, anal, and external genitalia swabs. This is a streamlined process that allows for immediate DNA analysis as soon as the items are submitted to the laboratory. Because they're all swabs, again, that's kind of why we've developed the kit. They're all swabs. They're in individual boxes. This process is very, very quick for us to do. It's a batch process, and they all go in for analysis for sexual assault kits. Once we get to the quantitation stage, step number 2 of the DNA analysis, and this may happen 3, 4 days after the items have come to the laboratory. These internal samples, we will assess them at the second stage, the quantitation stage, to decide whether any of the additional accepted items should be analyzed or not. If the quantitation results indicate that there is male DNA present, and we assess the results, and we in that assessment we've determined that a male DNA profile is going to be likely developed from those samples, then no additional examinations are conducted on the other items that may have been accepted. Maybe breast swabs or underwear or fingernail scrapings or any of those other items, because we believe we're going to have a male profile identified, and that looks like it's going to be a relevant profile for this investigation. We will then do no further analysis, and then we will wait for that sample to continue through the DNA process, and then we will do the report, the interpretation of those samples only, and the other samples will not be examined, and then everything gets returned back to the police agency. So what are some of these advantages? What are some of the advantages of doing this? Well, the sexual assault swabs, because they only go in for DNA testing, you might be thinking, oh, but what about the body fluids? Well, we can still do the body fluid testing if needed on that second swab that I spoke of, the second identical swab. If necessary, we can do this. Although early on, we got a few requests for this to happen as our clients got a little bit more comfortable with this approach, but now it's rarely requested. And we also feel that there is no loss of cellular material during the DNA result process now. So putting it right into DNA maximizes the possibility of developing a relevant DNA profile when the amount of DNA profile is potentially limiting. So we don't want to overhandle a sample for body fluid screening if at the end of the day there's only a small amount there. The act of those tests can further reduce the amount of DNA that's going to be available for subsequent DNA testing. So again, this is one of those advantages. We feel we can maximize the chance of generating a male DNA profile by not doing that body fluid testing up front. And then you also might be thinking, well, this is, we're used to doing body fluid first and then DNA. We also found through in-house experience and some studies that nowadays our DNA analysis is more sensitive than the body fluid testing we use. So in the past, swabs that were negative for body fluids were not being processed for DNA. If they were negative for body fluids, that was a stop, and they had no more further testing. But we know that we can actually generate DNA results on body fluids that have negative body fluid testing, and we can still generate male DNA profiles up to, as I spoke before, up to 12 days on a vaginal swab. We can still detect male DNA, whereas the body fluid chemicals, the body fluid tests that we employ, the chemicals that we're detecting, they may no longer be detectable up to 12 days. So again, the DNA analysis technology has progressed so far that it's now much more sensitive. So we feel that we are gaining additional results by employing this approach. And we're also able to reduce our turnaround time. So we have targets of either 30 or 60 days, depending on whether there is a suspect or there is not a suspect, because that lets us know whether, if there is no suspect, then we would do 30 days because we're trying to assist an investigation to identify somebody. Whereas if there is a suspect, then we'll do 60 days because they know who the person is, and it's just a matter of finding evidence to arrest them or hold them in custody. So one final thing that I want to talk about is, but what about attributing DNA to semen? Again, we did a study. And it's been can be found in the Forensic Science International Genetics. The citation is there below. We at the CFS used the results of the DNA analysis alone to provide an opinion about the presence of semen. I'm not going to go into all the data because there's lots of data, but please, if you're interested in that, this is the citation that my colleagues have done at the center that outlines the research that was done to get us to where we are right now. But what is the take-home message? What did we determine? Well, we wanted to determine under what circumstances can we be confident that in the absence of any serological results, so no body fluid testing, what conditions would we then do the DNA results obtained from a differential extraction suggest the presence of sperm cells? So we came up with an enrichment calculation, the amount of DNA in the sperm fraction divided by the total amount in the sperm fraction plus the total amount in the epithelial fraction, and that's kind of the calculation we use. And ultimately, if we have at least 240 picograms of male in the sperm fraction and at least a 50% enrichment based on the research we've conducted, this to us provides support for the presence of semen being suggested solely by the DNA results. And we will report it as results suggest the presence of semen. So our clients are still getting the information that they want with this direct DNA approach, where a lot of times we're providing them a DNA profile, and we're able to tell them, you know what, we have this DNA profile, and that male DNA profile is likely from semen based on the available data that we have. So they're not losing anything. And this is one of the reasons why we don't get a lot of the requests for body fluid results or body fluid testing, because they're still getting the information that the profile is likely arising from semen. So very quickly, how does all this feed into some case examples? So I've got two very quick ones. So if you have a female at a house party with friends, she's drinking heavily. She wakes up the next morning naked in one of the bedrooms of the house. The window in the room that she's in is open. So there is possible entry by an unknown suspect, or maybe a party attendee attended her room that she's unaware of. So she has no recollection of the evening and thinks that she may have been sexually assaulted. So the sexual assault kit is collected within 12 hours of the incident, and she did not have a shower. So this is the information that we have. So what are we looking at? What is our case approach then? So our staged acceptance is, because there's no history, because she was unconscious or passed out or heavily asleep during the time of the possible assault, we will accept oral swabs, external genitalia swabs, vaginal swabs, and anal swabs. We'll also accept the breast swabs because she did not shower. And we'll also accept the underwear that she was wearing at the time, or she put on immediately after the incident, that she likely wore to hospital because of the short timeline. That's the very subset of items that we'll examine as a first round. The other items that were collected, we're not going to accept at this time: fingernails, other skin swabs, which would be maybe from the neck or the face, pubic hair combings, and maybe other clothing, her bra, her dress, or whatever other clothing she was wearing that night. Again, is available, but we would not accept it at this time because we feel that the items that we are accepting are the ones that would have the greatest chance of generating a result. So we conduct this testing and we employ directed DNA analysis. So DTD, directed DNA. So the vaginal and external genitalia swabs comes back, there's DNA from the complainant plus one male, and the DNA result suggests the presence of semen. So a male DNA profile is interpreted, and it is likely arising from semen based on the DNA results that we have. The oral and anal swabs, there was insufficient DNA detected on those, so no further testing was done on those. No DNA analysis was attempted. So because we now have a male DNA profile that appears relevant to the case from the vaginal and external genitalia swabs, there's now no additional testing that's going to be conducted on the breast swabs or the underwear. And what happened is that because we've done this very quickly, this sample gets uploaded to the convicted offender gets uploaded to the data bank, and there was a hit to the convicted offender index on the DNA data bank. So we receive a name that is now provided to the police agency, and what went from a no suspect sexual assault, we now have a suspect name, and they're arrested within 30 days of the incident, because we've been able to do this very, very quickly without spending time doing tests that really wouldn't further get them any additional information, when really the ultimate question is there male DNA on our internal samples, and can we get it uploaded to the data bank to get a name? And yes, we can. And the second case I'm going to talk about is, again, sadly, another very standard case history. Is a female meets a known suspect in a park that she has met recently on a dating site. The suspect begins to kiss her, but then becomes more aggressive and demands sex. When she says no and tries to leave, he becomes angry and pushes her to the ground and sexually assaults her. She screams when she hears voices nearby, and he runs away. So in this instance, the assault has been interrupted. So vaginal penetration only, she has a very clear recollection of what's occurred. So she's indicated that it was only vaginal penetration. There was no ejaculation because he got scared off by the voices, but he did lick and grab her breasts, and she fights him off and defends herself, and she scratches him in that process. So the sexual assault kit was collected within 24 hours of the incident. No shower, but she did wash her face only. So again, the relevant internal samples: the external genitalia swab and vaginal swabs, because of the vaginal indication that it was only vaginal penetration. Breast swabs, because she specifically has said that there was licking or grabbing of her breasts. Fingernail scrapings, because she said that she fought him off and she scratched him, and the underwear that she was wearing. Other items that we're not going to accept: the skin swabs, again, because she washed her face, pubic hair combings, and again, other clothing. We may need to look at that down the road if we needed to, but depending on the results of the first round of testing, maybe we won't even have to examine those. So what's happened? So this is where, we have the opportunity to really assess kind of our expectations based on the case details using our experience. So the vaginal and external genitalia swabs utilize that streamlined process. They get processed right away. But based on the case details, I make a determination that because it's interrupted, because there's no indication of ejaculation, I'm not really expecting that there's going to be a large amount of male DNA detected on those samples. Maybe there would be, but I'm going to essentially make a decision to say, you know what, because I'm not sure, because the case details indicate to me a lower chance of detecting a male DNA profile on those internal swabs, although it's not impossible that we wouldn't detect male DNA, but I'm going to put in the breast swabs at the same time as those internal samples because of the case details that are provided to me. And in this instance, the internal swabs had insufficient male DNA detected, but the breast swabs, both from the left and the right breast, generated DNA from the complainant plus one male. So because we've done that up front, again, we have a very quick result. No additional testing is going to be required to be conducted at this time on the fingernail samples or underwear. And although there was a suspect in this case, she knew who he was. Our target was 60 days of incident. And based on this information, the suspect was arrested within 60 days of the incident, based on, again, the approach that we've taken with DNA analysis. We haven't had to over-test things, and we've really got to the crux of what is the information that the police agencies need from us to really advance their investigation at the outset, and that is DNA samples or DNA results. A lot of the time, specifically for sexual assault investigations. And then, so this is just a very quick summary. Of our case approach, we utilize the kit collection times that allows for developing DNA results in more occurrences that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to do if we had more restrictive collection timelines. The kit allows for streamlined DTD analysis on internal and external genitalia swabs. So that means the no body fluid testing prior to DNA analysis. We are able to provide an opinion on the presence of semen based on the DNA results only. So we're still able to provide that opinion to our clients in our reports. And we utilize hypothesis-based testing to determine what items should be examined to address an investigative question. And this allows us to limit the accepted items and which items that are actually ultimately tested to ultimately increase the turnaround time, not only of that case, but of the other cases that are waiting their turn to be examined. If we spend too much time on case number one, we then don't get to case number two as quickly, and that again can provide delays in your examination and process through your laboratory, not only in these cases, but in the other cases that your laboratory is handling. And that is really that's the end of what I wanted to say in terms of how we have approached our testing at the CFS. And at this time, I will give it back to Cynthia to continue this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are having some questions. Specifically, this is for you. Esteban Perez says, in Mexico, it is very difficult to obtain authorization to take samples from a suspect. In some cases, it could be helpful to take a sample from the suspect penis and look for DNA on it. But by the time it is authorized, the sample is already lost. Do you have that problem in Canada?
So I don't collect penile swabs personally, but we do get them. There are challenges with them, but I believe you, again, outside of kind of the law part of my experience, but we get penile swabs quite regularly. And typically it's collected upon arrest, and they have to have reason to believe that it's relevant. So if you're charged for a robbery, they're not going to have authorization to collect a swab of your penis if you just robbed a convenience store. Whereas if the allegation is a sexual assault, then they have that backing to collect that sample, because if, as you know, timing is of the essence. You don't want the individual to have an opportunity to wash themselves or shower or any of those things. But keep in mind, if you do have the inability if you have those challenges in your jurisdiction, remember that you do have the underwear of the individual available to you. So if you're not able to get the penile swab because of timelines or because of some legal argument that prevents you from collecting those, I think there's less issues with collecting the accused's clothing, like you would in any investigation looking for blood from an accused or from a complainant on their clothing. You'd have authority to collect the clothing. So similarly, you can examine the inside of the pair of underwear that they were wearing at the time, again to looking for transfer of what was on the penis potentially that has now been transferred to the inside of their underwear, the closest article of clothing. So you can still utilize that as well as an option if you run into those difficulties. But for us here, we get those samples quite regularly, and we don't have maybe the same challenges that you have there.
Thank you. Ms. Santos, can you, Maestra Santos, ¿podrían dar en la respuesta, por favor?
Bueno, en específico para ese tipo de casos en donde se tiene que colectar una muestra del pene del agresor, sí, en mi experiencia, sí se pueden obtener esas muestras, porque no es solamente tomar de cualquier parte del miembro, es una parte en específica que es el surco balano prepucial, donde podemos obtener una mayor muestra, una mayor cantidad de muestra que nos permita poder identificar algún rastro femenino. Entonces sí hemos trabajado en ese tipo de muestras. Afortunadamente pues se han podido colectar esas muestras siempre con la autorización de esa persona, del sospechoso, aunque sí es un poco más complicado obtener un perfil genético femenino puro a partir de esa muestra, pero en ocasiones hemos podido obtener mezclas. Entonces ya podemos ahí ya sea no excluir a la víctima como parte de esa mezcla genética.
Muchas gracias, maestra.
Cynthia, can I add just one more thing just to my...
Please.
One thing that we do have to be cautious of here in Canada is, or what is instructed is, when we accept, or when the swab of the penis or any swab of a suspect's body is collected, we are not allowed to utilize the DNA that is expected to come from the owner of that body. So whether they swab their penis or their arm or their fingernails, because we're collecting those, not if it's from a male individual, we're not collecting that DNA to generate the male DNA profile. That's not the profile of interest. So we can't use that to compare to other samples in the case. That's not a comparison sample. Mm-hmm. The authorization and the reason for collecting it is to determine whether there's DNA in those areas sampled that are not from that individual that is relevant to the case. So that is kind of where I think that we navigate it very carefully, is we then can't utilize the swab of his penis to get his male DNA profile and utilize that to upload to the data bank. That is not allowed, because that wasn't the purpose of collecting that sample. It wasn't to get his DNA, because we know that if we swab someone's body, we're likely going to get their DNA in that swab. So that's not the purpose. It's the purpose of finding the foreign DNA profile, the profile that's not theirs. So that's something that it's been recent in terms of case law that has come out with what we can and can't do with those samples with respect to utilizing the profiles developed from them, specifically the profiles from the person whose body that is being swabbed when it comes to from accused persons or from suspects.
That's a really interesting approach. Maestra Santos, ¿quiere abordar sobre este tema?
Sí, solamente complementar lo que acaba de decir Randy. Es muy importante que tengamos nosotros presente que efectivamente cuando se le toma la muestra al sospechoso, por ejemplo en este caso que pueda ser del pene, solamente puede ser utilizada con ese fin de identificar en este caso un aporte femenino, pero no podemos utilizar esa información como una muestra de referencia. En dado caso que nosotros quisiéramos ligar a este individuo en concreto con un caso en específico, con el caso que se está investigando, nosotros tenemos que tomar una muestra de referencia. Entonces se le notifica al sospechoso que se requiere una muestra de referencia, que puede ser sangre o puede ser saliva o puede ser un elemento piloso. Pero ya él tiene el conocimiento que entonces a partir de esas muestras sí se va a obtener la información genética de él y va a poder ser comparada con los resultados que se pueda obtener de estas evidencias, bueno, de estas muestras biológicas que se van a tomar a la víctima.
Muchas gracias, maestra. La siguiente pregunta que nos plantea Marichuy tiene que ver con el manejo de muestras. The handling of samples and the protocols are the same when dealing with sexual abuse towards a minor? ¿Qué nos podría decir al respecto, maestra? Tratándose de los protocolos hacia menores de edad.
Se siguen los mismos protocolos. Aquí en México tenemos, recordemos, fiscalías de delitos sexuales, que son fiscalías especializadas, donde uno va y pone su denuncia y ahí tenemos peritos médicos que son mujeres y son especializadas en la toma y la colecta de las muestras. Entonces, es independiente de qué sexo tenga el individuo que fue agredido o en este caso si fue un menor, si fue un niño, ellas están capacitadas para realizar una colecta efectiva, una colecta idónea de la muestra para que nosotros una vez que llegan al laboratorio podamos trabajar con esas muestras.
Muchas gracias. Mr. Randy, same question. The handling of samples and the protocols are the same when dealing with sexual abuse towards a minor?
They're not. No, we will instruct when it's an individual who has not undergone puberty. We suggest collection only up to 3 days, and that is based on the physiology and the expectation that it's really more going to be external. Obviously, very case dependent. If details are such that it's there is internal penetration and significant injury and damage to the individual, then of course we can take a very different approach. But in general, because the physiology and the vaginal area is not developed for those individuals who haven't gone through puberty, we do tend to take the approach that it's within 3 days for those external for the samples that are collected.
Thank you.
Perdón que te interrumpa, me gustaría nada más complementar que cuando son menores sí es importante que estén el padre o tutor presente, quien van a dar las autorizaciones para que se puedan tomar estas muestras.
Gracias, maestra. La siguiente pregunta que nos plantea Javo Cárdenas tiene que ver con el tiempo máximo que puede transcurrir desde que sucedió el evento hasta la toma de una muestra, antes de que se pierda el ADN masculino en un cadáver.
Bueno, en cuanto a los cadáveres, ahí ya cambia la cosa. Nosotros cuando laboraba yo para la Procuraduría de la Ciudad de México, nosotros nos encargábamos como peritos en genética en tomar las muestras a los cadáveres para poder identificar algún rastro de semen. Entonces, podríamos localizar todavía trazas de una información genética masculina hasta 12, 14 días después no de que haya muerto, sino de que quizás se pudo haberse efectuado esta agresión sexual, ¿no? De que hayan localizado el cadáver y que después nos hayan mandado a llamar, pues en una ocasión nos encontramos con una chica que estaba ya en proceso de putrefacción, pero el cuerpo estaba semisumergido en un cuerpo de agua. Entonces, la parte de donde ella tenía las pantaletas a mitad de las piernas y en las pantaletas sí se localiza un rastro de semen, ya en cavidades no. Ya cuando el cuerpo ya está en estado de putrefacción, ya no localizamos nosotros un rastro.
Gracias, maestra, por su respuesta. Mr. Randy, the same question. Javo Cárdenas asks us, how long does it take for the male DNA to be lost before a sample is taken on a corpse?
So the timelines are different when you're dealing with a deceased individual. For obvious reasons, someone who is deceased is not moving around. They are typically, in some lying down position, which means that the ways that DNA will be leaving your body are different. You're not moving around, you're not exercising, you're not showering, you're not doing all those things that people who are alive are doing. So when it's a homicide linked to a sexual investigation, the timelines are a little bit different, or they can be. And also because when samples are taken at autopsy, they are able to take samples differently than they would be taken during the collection of a routine sexual assault investigation. They're doing it while they're conducting the autopsy. So they're swabbing from areas that you wouldn't necessarily be able to swab very effectively in an individual who arrives at a hospital alive, complaining of a sexual assault. So some of those timelines can be different, and of course, homicides take on a different life of their own as well. So some of those timelines are different, and your investigation approach is quite different. But also for our at autopsy, where they're taking samples for possible sexual assault, they'll actually take 3 samples at autopsy instead of 2. So we'll have more samples available to us to do testing, and that's because they have the body there available to them during autopsy to take maybe more samples or different types of samples, different areas that they otherwise couldn't get to.
Me gustaría andar un poco más en ese sentido. Nosotros también tomamos, cuando son las muestras a cadáveres, inclusive cuando son personas vivas, se toman 3 hisopos de cada una de las áreas. En las personas vivas, bueno, dependiendo de dónde refiere a la víctima que fue la agresión, cómo se desarrollaron estos eventos. Cuando son cadáveres, bueno, ya existe aquí en México un protocolo de feminicidios. Entonces, ese protocolo nos indica qué muestras tenemos que tomar. Entonces, están las muestras vaginales, en donde, como menciona Randy, lo que hacemos es tratar de obtener la muestra de fondo de saco vaginal, por si hay algún rastro, podernoslos traer. Están las vulvares, donde colectamos muestra del genital. Están las muestras anales y perianales para poder nosotros de alguna manera optimizar que se pueda colectar algún rastro masculino si es que hay, y aparte se toman muestras de senos, el pecho y el cuello para poder identificar algún rastro de saliva. Esto es efectivo cuando no está en proceso de descomposición el cuerpo. Ya cuando está en proceso de descomposición es poco probable que lleguemos a obtener algún rastro de semen masculino, en caso de ser el cuerpo de una femenina.
Gracias, maestra. Tenemos una última pregunta. Nos pregunta León Negro. Are there new sequencing technologies to differentiate the male and female alleles in a DNA mixture? If so, is this technology being applied in forensic casework in Canada?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Are there new sequencing technologies to differentiate the male and female alleles in a DNA mixture? If so, is this technology being applied in forensic casework in Canada?
So we're not using, I'm not aware of anything that specifically is able to differentiate right now between, if you think of the areas that we're targeting on our DNA sequences, are on the different chromosomes, a number of different chromosomes that both males and females share. We're just targeting specific regions on those sequences that and those areas are the same for males and females, and we generate a DNA result. Now, we do have available to us YSTR technology, and we have had that for a number of years. Since we've been using it since 2006, I believe, but the technology has been around for a long time. And YSTR technology, of course, allows you to focus only on the male DNA that's present. And a lot of times when you have a case where the complainant has attended the hospital much closer to the 12-day time frame since incident, then more than likely the DNA profile that you're going to be able to develop is likely going to be a YSTR DNA profile, because what it allows is that this technology only focuses on areas in the DNA that are found on the Y chromosome, and only males have Y chromosome. So it's able to ignore essentially everything else that's contained in that sample that's not on the Y chromosome, which allows us to better to be able to basically detect male DNA in amongst, a large amount of female. So I'm not sure if that answers the question. The technology is moving very, very quickly. I'm sure there's research that's happening to see whether there are methylations that are different in males and females and things of that nature. But again, I don't work at a research laboratory, so we always kind of joke sometimes that, forensic DNA is almost working, 5 or 10 years behind the research, because we don't have the luxury of using, quote unquote, novel techniques, because those need to really be really understood and learned about in a research setting before so we know the limitations, we know the conditions under which reliable results can be retained, we know all those things about the technology before we then apply it to, cases in a forensic community that needs to be tested in court. So the technology then that we use comes out of research, but it comes out of research once research has really learned and moved through some of the technology bumps, if you will, and then eventually what comes out of that is its application to the law and forensic science. So that process is moving much more quickly than it has in the past, as I'm sure Carmen knows. But we don't have the luxury of deciding tomorrow to utilize a new technique, because it really needs to be tested in the scientific community before we really apply it to our types of samples that, we may only have one chance to generate a result from a sample, whereas research, they have access to essentially unlimited sample a lot of times, right? They're not as worried about it not working, because they're learning about the technology. Whereas when we get it, we need to make sure, does it work? Because we may only have one chance at this sample. So it's that battle back and forth with us progressing, but also not progressing too quickly. So when we use the technology, it is well understood and reliable.
Thank you so much. Miss Santos. Por favor, maestra.
Sí, efectivamente tiene mucha razón lo que dice Randy. No contamos ahorita con una tecnología que solamente procesando la muestra, y al momento de que se haga esta electroforesis capilar, ya el software nos diga, estos salelos provienen de una mujer, estos salelos provienen de un hombre. No es de manera automática. En el caso de las mezclas, de los perfiles genéticos en mezcla, pues ahí lo que podemos hacer es obtener el perfil genético de la muestra de referencia de la víctima. Entonces ya la tenemos a ella aislada de alguna forma, y poder determinar cuáles son los alelos de ella en la mezcla. Y cuando se tenga al sospechoso, a la persona que está señalado como el agresor, tomarle una muestra de referencia, obtener su perfil genético y ver si su información genética está presente o no en esa mezcla. Eso es lo que podemos hacer por el momento, pero que se genere de manera automática, no ¿no? Y sí es importante tener mucha claridad, y me gustaría retomar algo que dijo Randy, que es muy importante, que si bien cuando se hace investigación, pues se llegan a muchas mejoras, ¿sí? Nosotros, al momento de aplicarlo en el campo forense, sí tiene que estar súper bien analizado y demostrado que funciona, porque la mayoría de las ocasiones las muestras forenses solamente tenemos una oportunidad de procesarlas para obtener un resultado. Entonces no podemos repetir los análisis como cuando se está haciendo investigación.
Muchas gracias. Con esto daremos por concluida esta conferencia interactiva y agradecemos la participación de nuestros ponentes esta tarde, así como la claridad, el orden y la abundancia con que han tocado este tema especializado. Agradecemos enormemente a todas y a todos nuestros espectadores que nos han acompañado en esta sesión. Finalmente, les invitamos a descargar el podcast INACIPE, con nuevos episodios disponibles cada jueves y que pueden descargar desde Spotify. Muchísimas gracias y nos vemos hasta la próxima.
Gracias, hasta luego.